The suburbs of Albuquerque stretch under the merciless New Mexico sun, where Walter White stands before his high school chemistry class, a man diminished by life's disappointments. His posture, his voice, his very presence speaks of resignation. A brilliant mind trapped in mediocrity, teaching disinterested teenagers about the transformative power of chemistry, while his own life remains unchanged. This is where our journey begins, not with the drug kingpin Heisenberg, but with Walt, the everyman whose shadow self lies dormant. In Jungian psychology, the shadow represents everything we deny about ourselves: the repressed desires, the unacknowledged ambitions, the capacity for darkness we refuse to recognize. For Walter White, his shadow contains his rage at being overlooked, his bitterness at watching less brilliant men succeed, and his desperate need to be recognized as exceptional. These feelings don't simply disappear when denied, they fester in the unconscious, growing stronger in the darkness. The diagnosis of terminal lung cancer doesn't create Walter's shadow. It merely removes the barriers keeping it contained. When faced with his mortality, the thin veneer of social propriety cracks, and what emerges isn't just a man making desperate choices, but the embodiment of repressed potential seeking expression. The shadow doesn't announce itself with dramatic flair. It begins with small rationalizations. I am doing this for my family. This is the seductive nature of the shadow's emergence. It always comes bearing gifts of justification. Walt's initial decision to cook methamphetamine carries the noble disguise of providing for his family after his death. This rationalization is the first step in what Jung would recognize as a dangerous dance with the shadow, where conscious morality makes room for unconscious desires by draping them in acceptability. The transformation from Walter White to Heisenberg isn't merely a character development, it's a psychological excavation. The pork pie hat, the sunglasses, even the shaved head. These aren't just cosmetic changes, but symbolic representations of the shadow self taking physical form. Heisenberg becomes the vessel for everything Walter has denied himself: power, respect, fear, and a terrible freedom from social constraints. What makes Breaking Bad so psychologically compelling is how it mirrors our own relationship with our shadow. We watch Walter's transformation with a mixture of horror and vicarious thrill. We condemn his actions while secretly admiring his refusal to remain small. This dual reaction reveals our own complex relationship with the darker aspects of our psyche. The suburban landscape of Albuquerque serves as the perfect backdrop for this shadow work, its mundane normalcy highlighting the extraordinary psychological journey unfolding within it. The desert, with its harsh emptiness, becomes the symbolic unconscious where Walter confronts and eventually embraces his shadow. These settings aren't merely aesthetic choices, but psychological landscapes reflecting the inner terrain of transformation. I am not in danger. I am the danger, Walter declares in one of the show's most chilling moments. This isn't merely a threat, it's a psychological declaration. It marks the moment when the shadow doesn't just emerge, but begins to dominate consciousness. Jung would recognize this as a critical and dangerous point in the individuation process, when the shadow, rather than being integrated, threatens to consume the personality entirely. The relationship between Walter and Jesse Pinkman represents another dimension of shadow work: the projection of disowned aspects of the self onto others. Walter initially sees in Jesse everything he despises: irresponsibility, wasted potential, moral compromise. Yet as the series progresses, we realize that Walter projects onto Jesse precisely to avoid recognizing these qualities in himself. The genius of Breaking Bad as a Jungian narrative is that it doesn't present Walter's transformation as either wholly villainous or heroic. Instead, it shows the tragic consequences of what Jung would call shadow possession. when repressed aspects of personality return with overwhelming force, leading not to integration, but to psychological inflation and moral collapse. Chemistry is the study of change, Walter tells his students in the pilot episode, unwittingly forecasting his own alchemical transformation. In Jungian terms, alchemy serves as the perfect metaphor for the individuation process, the transformation of base elements into something precious. Walter's expertise in chemistry becomes the external manifestation of an internal psychological process, where the lead of his ordinary life transforms into the gold of power and recognition. The RV where Walter first cooks methamphetamine functions as what Jung would call a temenos, a sacred space where transformation occurs. Isolated in the desert, removed from the structures and expectations of society, Walter enters a liminal space where his shadow can emerge without immediate consequences. This psychological container allows for the initial stages of his transformation, protected from the judgment of the collective. The blue methamphetamine that becomes Walter's signature product symbolizes the externalization of his shadow self. Pure, powerful, and dangerously addictive. Its distinctive color represents the unique expression of Walter's repressed brilliance, now channeled into destruction rather than creation. The pride he takes in its purity reveals how the shadow, once expressed, demands acknowledgement and even celebration. Jung observed that the shadow, when denied conscious expression, often manifests through compulsive behavior and obsession. Walter's meticulous approach to cooking methamphetamine, his insistence on purity, his scientific precision, represents the shadow-finding expression through the very qualities that were undervalued in his legitimate life. His repressed excellence now serves his darkest impulses. The transformation accelerates when Walter shaves his head, a ritual act that symbolizes the shedding of his former identity. This physical change marks a psychological threshold crossing, where the shadow gains greater control. In Jungian terms, this represents a dangerous point in the individuation process, where identification with the shadow threatens to overwhelm the conscious personality. "Say my name," Walter demands of his criminal associates in a pivotal scene. This insistence on recognition reveals the shadow's hunger for acknowledgement after years of repression. The name Heisenberg, borrowed from a scientist known for uncertainty, becomes the verbal embodiment of Walter's shadow self, demanding to be seen and feared rather than ignored and dismissed. The chemical process of cooking methamphetamine serves as a perfect metaphor for shadow integration gone wrong. Rather than transforming the raw materials of his repressed self into something that serves life, Walter creates a substance that destroys it. This perversion of the alchemical process reflects Jung's warning about the dangers of shadow work without ethical consciousness. Walter's cancer diagnosis functions as what Jung would call the call to adventure, the initiating crisis that begins the hero's journey. However, unlike the traditional hero who faces the shadow to integrate it, Walter surrenders to it. His physical disease becomes the permission slip for a psychological surrender, where the threat of death removes the barriers to expressing his darkest impulses. The famous scene where Walter stands in his underwear in the desert, pointing a gun down the road, captures the vulnerability and desperation of the early stages of shadow emergence. Half-clothed, between identities, Walter stands at the threshold between his former self and what he is becoming. This liminal state, this psychological nakedness, represents the dangerous territory of shadow confrontation. As Walter's transformation progresses, his relationship with chemistry evolves from creation to destruction. The same knowledge that once allowed him to explain the beauty of chemical reactions to students now enables him to eliminate enemies with ricin and explosives. This perversion of his gift illustrates Jung's warning about the shadow's capacity to corrupt our greatest talents when it remains unintegrated. "I did it for the family" becomes Walter's mantra, his conscious justification for increasingly unconscionable acts. This rationalization reveals what Jung identified as the shadow's ability to disguise itself in noble intentions. The family man persona, Walter's conscious identity, becomes the mask behind which the shadow operates, allowing him to maintain the illusion of moral purpose even as his actions betray his stated values. The relationship between Walter and his wife Skylar embodies the tension between the persona, our social mask, and the shadow. Initially, Walter hides his criminal activities from Skylar, maintaining the facade of the mild-mannered husband. This split between his home life and his criminal enterprise represents the psychological compartmentalization that allows the shadow to operate unchecked. "I am the one who knocks," Walter declares to Skylar in a moment of shadow eruption, where the carefully maintained boundary between his two selves momentarily collapses. This terrifying glimpse of Walter's transformed nature reveals the psychological truth that the shadow, once empowered, cannot remain perfectly contained. It leaks into all relationships, transforming them in its image. The White family home, once a sanctuary of middle-class normalcy, gradually transforms into a psychological battlefield as Walter's shadow self infiltrates his domestic life. The swimming pool, in particular, becomes a recurring symbol of the unconscious forces threatening to drown the family's stability. From Walter's dissociative episodes beside it to the plain debris that crashes into it, the pool represents the eruption of unconscious content into conscious life. Walter's relationship with his son, Flynn, Walter Jr., represents another dimension of the shadow's impact. As Walter embraces his shadow, his son increasingly rejects him, eventually refusing to even acknowledge his name. This estrangement symbolizes how shadow possession alienates us not only from others, but from our legacy, the future we hoped to influence positively. The infant daughter Holly becomes the last repository of Walter's family man persona. His kidnapping of her in Ozymandias, followed by his tearful return of her, represents the final conflict between his stated motivation, family, and his actual motivation, power. This moment of clarity, where he recognizes the harm he's caused to the very people he claimed to protect, offers a brief window into what Jung would call the beginning of shadow integration, seeing the damage caused by unconscious forces. Hank Schrader, Walter's DEA agent brother-in-law, functions as what Jung would call the moral shadow, the embodiment of the social conscience Walter increasingly abandons. Their relationship represents the tension between collective values and individual desires. When Walter ultimately causes Hank's death, it symbolizes the complete rejection of social morality in favor of personal power. The gradual corruption of Jesse Pinkman under Walter's influence demonstrates the contagious nature of the unintegrated shadow. Jesse begins as a small-time criminal, but retains a moral core that Walter systematically erodes. This relationship illustrates Jung's observation that the unacknowledged shadow doesn't remain personal. It spreads, infecting relationships and creating ripples of destruction beyond the individual. The iconic scene where Walter watches Jane die, choosing not to save her, marks a critical threshold in his shadow possession. This act of passive murder reveals how the shadow, once given authority, makes moral compromises that would have been unthinkable to the former self. The rationalization that follows, that he did it to protect Jesse from her influence, demonstrates the shadow's ability to justify even the most horrific acts. By the series' end, Walter finally admits, "I did it for me. I liked it. I was good at it. And I was alive." This confession represents a moment of psychological truth, the recognition that his actions were driven not by family obligation, but by shadow gratification. This honesty, coming too late to save him or heal the damage he's caused, illustrates Jung's warning that delayed shadow integration often comes at tremendous cost. Walter White's transformation illustrates what Jung identified as inflation, the ego's dangerous identification with archetypal power. As Walter embraces his shadow and becomes Heisenberg, He experiences a psychological expansion that feels like empowerment, but actually represents a dangerous imbalance. "I am the danger" isn't just a threat, it's a statement of psychological inflation, where the ego has usurped the power of the self. The recurring motif of Walter's reflection, in mirrors, in polished surfaces of lab equipment, in the chrome of his revolver, symbolizes the growing split in his psyche. These doubled images represent the increasing distance between his conscious self-perception and the reality of what he's becoming. Jung would recognize this motif as representing the crucial psychological task Walter fails to accomplish, seeing himself clearly. Walter's cancer goes into remission midway through the series, removing his initial justification for his criminal activities. This plot development serves a profound psychological purpose. It forces Walter to confront the truth that his transformation was never truly about survival or providing for his family. The removal of the death sentence reveals the shadow's actual motivation: power, recognition, and the intoxication of unleashed potential. The famous "I am the one who knocks" speech reveals the ego's intoxication with shadow power. Walter no longer sees himself as a victim of circumstances, but as a force of nature. This inflation represents what Jung would call the dangerous conflation of the ego with the shadow, where the conscious personality becomes identified with unconscious forces it neither fully understands nor controls. Walter's obsession with his former colleagues at Gray Matter Technologies reveals the wounded ego at the core of his shadow. His bitterness at being bought out of what became a billion-dollar company represents the narcissistic injury fueling his transformation. This unresolved wound demonstrates Jung's observation that the shadow often organizes itself around our deepest hurts and perceived injustices. The character of Gus Fring serves as a mirror for Walter, a refined, controlled expression of the shadow that Walter both admires and resents. Their power struggle represents the ego's resistance to acknowledging that its shadow expressions aren't unique or special. Walter's need to defeat Gus stems not just from self-preservation, but from the inflated ego's refusal to accept any power greater than itself. Walter's famous declaration, "Say my name," to his criminal associates, reveals the ego's hunger for recognition once it has embraced shadow power. This demand for acknowledgement illustrates Jung's observation that the shadow, once expressed, seeks validation and fears being relegated back to the unconscious. The name Heisenberg becomes the verbalization of Walter's inflated self-concept. The recurring imagery of Walter alone in vast spaces, the desert, empty industrial facilities, his isolated cabin in New Hampshire, symbolizes the psychological isolation that comes with shadow possession. As Walter's ego identifies more completely with his shadow, he experiences what Jung would call alienation from the self, a profound disconnection from both his authentic nature and from human community. The iconic scene where Walter rolls a barrel of money through the desert after losing everything else represents the ultimate fruit of his shadow journey: material wealth divorced from relationship or meaning. This powerful image captures Jung's warning about the spiritual poverty that results from shadow possession, where external gains cannot compensate for internal fragmentation. In the series finale, Walter admits to Skylar, "I did it for me." This confession represents a moment of ego deflation, the recognition that his grandiose justifications were self-deception. This truth-telling, coming only at the end of his life, illustrates Jung's observation that genuine psychological insight often comes only after the damage of inflation has run its course. Breaking Bad resonates so deeply with audiences because Walter White embodies what Jung called the cultural shadow of contemporary America, the repressed aspects of a society that values success above all else while offering limited pathways to achieve it. Walter's transformation from undervalued teacher to drug kingpin reflects collective anxieties about worth, recognition, and the corrupting influence of unchecked capitalism. The Albuquerque setting, positioned between the affluent world of the American dream and the desperate reality of the Mexican border, creates the perfect liminal space for exploring shadow dynamics. This borderland represents the psychological territory between conscious values and unconscious drives, between social propriety and primal survival, between the person we present to the world and the one we hide. The meth epidemic that forms the backdrop of the series represents a collective shadow expression, the dark underbelly of American consumer culture, where desire for escape and artificial euphoria creates markets for destruction. Walter doesn't create this demand. He exploits it, becoming a dark entrepreneur in an economy of addiction. This relationship between individual and collective shadow illustrates Jung's observation that personal psychology never exists in isolation from cultural forces. The series' exploration of the American healthcare system, where Walter's initial turn to crime is precipitated by the cost of cancer treatment, highlights how societal failures create conditions for shadow emergence. The inadequacy of social safety nets forces individuals to confront systemic limitations, creating fertile ground for the shadow's justifications and rationalizations. The character of Saul Goodman represents what Jung might call the trickster archetype, the amoral facilitator who exists in the shadowlands between legitimate and criminal worlds. His catchphrase, "Better call Saul," becomes an invitation to shadow expression, offering seemingly consequence-free access to darker impulses. His popularity as a character reveals our collective fascination with those who navigate shadow territories with a moral ease. The visual motif of the American desert serves as the perfect symbolic landscape for shadow work. Its emptiness represents the unconscious. Its harshness embodies the unforgiving nature of shadow confrontation. Its beauty, amid desolation, reflects the strange allure of our darker aspects. When Walter stands in this landscape, he stands in the externalized territory of the American unconscious. The series' exploration of the drug trade between the United States and Mexico reflects the shadow aspects of international relations, the exploitative economic dynamics that create conditions for criminality across borders. Walter's position as a white American who rises to dominate this trade reflects uncomfortable truths about power, privilege, and who ultimately profits from systems of addiction and desperation. The character of Mike Ehrmantraut represents what Jung might call the mature shadow, a man who has integrated his capacity for violence and criminality into a coherent, if not conventionally moral, code. His pragmatism and lack of illusions about his nature stand in contrast to Walter's self-deception. Mike's famous line, "No more half measures," speaks to the psychological commitment required to live consciously with one's shadow. The series' unflinching portrayal of consequences, the ripple effects of Walter's choices on countless lives, reflects Jung's insistence that shadow work requires accountability. Unlike many anti-hero narratives that allow vicarious shadow expression without real costs, Breaking Bad shows how shadow possession destroys not just the individual, but entire systems of relationship. This moral accounting makes the series not just entertaining, but psychologically instructive. The enduring cultural impact of Breaking Bad demonstrates Jung's observation that powerful archetypal narratives capture something essential about the collective psyche. Walter White has become more than a character. He's a psychological reference point, a cautionary tale, and a mirror for our own relationship with power, recognition, and the temptation to break bad. Our continued fascination with his journey reveals our collective need to understand the shadow before it understands us. As we close this journey through the psychological landscape of Breaking Bad, I invite you to pause and look inward. Walter White's transformation isn't merely compelling television. It's a warning etched in the desert sand of our collective unconscious. We watch his descent with a mixture of horror and fascination because, in those quiet moments of honesty, we recognize fragments of ourselves in his journey. the passed over promotion we still resent, the recognition we secretly crave, the fleeting thought of what might happen if we remove the constraints that keep our darker impulses in check. Jung understood that the shadow isn't our enemy. It's the disowned part of ourselves waiting for acknowledgement. The danger comes not from having a shadow, but from refusing to see it. Walter White's tragedy wasn't that he had darkness within him. It's that when it emerged, he surrendered to it completely rather than integrating it consciously. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of Breaking Bad is not what it reveals about Walter White, but what it reveals about us, the viewers who couldn't look away. Our fascination speaks to the universal nature of the shadow. We are drawn to this story because it speaks to something ancient and powerful within the human psyche. The knowledge that we all contain multitudes, including aspects of ourselves we'd rather not face. But unlike Walter, we have a choice. We can learn to recognize our shadow before crisis forces it into the light. We can acknowledge our darker impulses without being defined by them. We can seek wholeness rather than fragmentation. As you leave this video and return to your life, I invite you to carry this question with you. What parts of yourself have you disowned that might be seeking expression? What would it mean to acknowledge them without surrendering to them? The path of integration is neither easy nor straight, but it leads toward wholeness, toward a life where we neither deny our darkness nor are consumed by it. The true power of Jung's psychology isn't that it explains our darkness, it's that it offers us a way through it. And perhaps that's the final lesson of Breaking Bad. Even in our darkest moments, we always have a choice about who we become. If this exploration of Walter White through the lens of Jungian psychology resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What aspects of your own shadow did this analysis bring to light? How do you see these psychological principles playing out in other characters or stories? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the psychology behind the stories that shape our culture. Each week, we'll explore another facet of the human psyche through the mirror of modern mythology. Thank you for joining me in the Shadowlands. Until next time, remember that the first step toward wholeness is simply being willing to see yourself clearly.